Okay, so I'm ready to draw. I know about the pencils. I know that negative space is the space created by an object. It's around and within the actual positive space of the object. I know that that exists. I know that proportion is size relationship. I know that how tall one thing is in relation to its width helps me to kind of gauge the size of the object when I go to draw. At least I should know that if I have been paying attention in class. I know that I can shade and get texture, but now I'm asked to create a still life drawing. And all these objects, my left side of the brain is kind of jumping in and naming everything. And I am going to run into some problems. So let's talk about those problems now. This video is about negative space and how you can use negative space to help you when it comes to placement and proportion. Okay, so it's a little trick that I like to give my students when it comes to drawing multiple objects. All right, so I have here a picture of this still life. And in this picture, I have, a mug, and mugs are great to do. Mugs are great to draw. Not many mugs are alike. So you get to really kind of pay attention to subtle nuances in shape and really get to know like how to draw that mug instead of a mug. So I always like to kind of throw a mug in there. And so I have just a couple other objects, something more organic and something with a wooden texture. So in this still life, I have put it in front of a white background on just a tabletop surface. My white background is just a folded piece of paper behind it. You don't have to have much around the house to set up your own still life. If you can't find a large piece of paper to place behind, you can always drape some solid fabric. If you're just starting out, I suggest solids. I suggest not having something that has a pattern to it. Okay. So I'm going to look at this now and think, all right, well, I have to start drawing. And I'm going to show you a little trick that I call constellations, that are called constellations, when it comes to kind of mapping out your drawing. So this is not even at negative space yet. This is just giving the idea of what is in space, right? So, we look into the stars and we see little points that when they're connected, they can make a large picture, right? So, and our mind completes the image. It's the same concept. So I have, I know I want this to fill my page. I don't want a dinky little still life drawing in the center of my page. And I certainly don't want to start with one object and then just kind of domino and build off of that yet. Without planning, and then cut off an object in my drawing, right? So that could cause a lot of compositional errors, which composition will be taught later. So I have this scene, right, this still life, and I want to just kind of map it out. I know that my plant ends about, just almost at the top of the page. And so I have that mark there. Instead of a pencil, I'm actually going to use a Sharpie. And instead of drawing on a piece of paper, I'm just going to actually map it out onto the printout. Okay. So on my paper, I would take a pencil and I would just kind of make a mark, just like a little Y mark. Say, okay, that is how high my plant needs to go. And then I use the sighting method. I can use my Sharpie, my pencil, and just kind of get an idea of how far over and down I think the next important part of my drawing should be. So I think that my next important part of my drawing is actually the tip of this leaf. So I would look at my still life and I would map it out. I would kind of use my sighting method to kind of get that angle, and then I would make that next mark on my page. Okay, so remember, this is on a blank page, and then I would use the same method to kind of figure out, all right, how far over in relation to that and in relation to the edge of the page and this corner is the edge of this mug, the handle of the mug. I would make that mark on my page, and then I would figure out, okay, how far up is about the bottom of my mug here, and then how far over, using the sighting method, using my angle, checking it out. How far over and down is this here, okay? And then I use the same kind of technique to figure out how far down and over is the edge of the mortar and pestle, and then how far in and up, and I kind of gauge it and I make a mark there, okay? Using that, I now have edges. It's like a border, right? And it's a constellation. Now you could get further into your constellations. You could, you know, measure how far over is the edge of the mug here, and then maybe this edge here of the important plant. And then you can make a few more Y marks and X marks to try and kind of map things out like a constellation, right? They're just tiny little light marks using pencil on your drawing paper. Now that I have those in place, my job is to start drawing things in, okay? There are a lot of different ways that artists like to do that, okay? Some of them like to do what is called blocking. So you break down the drawing into just basic shapes. So now that I have these, I can kind of see the proportion and the size of how big this plant should fit within, right? And then I could see how big this mug should be. I can start to kind of break down and block in these shapes, these general shapes, okay? Some artists like to just begin with contour line drawing. And my point is you can block in, and you don't have to if that's a technique that doesn't work for you. And these constellations help you enough where you can begin to draw and domino effect, I call it, build, build, build off of an object. You know that you have these parameters in place. The other thing that helps is paying attention to the whole point of this video, negative space. So as I'm drawing, if I pay attention to the shapes created by the object, I can keep that object's size in check, right? So if I look at the negative space and it's too small, then I know that something's wrong with the positive space. I drew something a little off, maybe a little too big, right? And then the same goes, you know, vice versa. If the negative space is just a really big negative space, I might have drawn something too small. So I'm going to show you an example of that. So I have, you know, I'm drawing this object, I'm drawing my plant, and I'm paying attention to where some things start in comparison to where some things begin, and I build off. Now, if I were to look at that still life from the left side of the brain, and then draw, giving myself like verbal directions, I might end up with something like this. So I just took a picture of it a little different. And in our mind, we think plant is in the middle, mortar and pestles to the left, boom, and mug is to the right, done. And I could draw those perfectly fine in themselves. My leaves will have texture. I'll have the texture and a value in this planter. I'll have some highlights on my mug, and I'll have some of the texture and values in this mortar and pestle. But then I'll be like, something's off. Like I drew this, I mapped it out, each object, and I'm adding in the value. Why does this not look like my still life? And the reason that could happen is because you let your left side of the brain give you the directions. We don't want to do that. We want the right side of the brain to spatially give us directions. And those directions are done with negative space. Okay, so if I were to look at the negative spaces created here, right, I would notice a big gaping space here. So I'm going to bring back my old picture, my picture of the actual still life. And I'm going to kind of mark the negative spaces that are created between two objects, okay? So I have this negative space here. So I notice that my mortar and pestle comes in front of the planter. And so there is no negative space right here between them, right? So this is the negative space that's created between the mortar and pestle and the plant. That is my negative space. And this is what I would check. As I was drawing, I would check this to make sure that the placement and proportion of my one object is correct in comparison to the other, right? So if we were to pull back this one, well, my mortar and pestle is not overlapping, right? And it just goes on the negative space. The plant doesn't even touch to close in the negative space of the mortar and pestle. So if this was how I was beginning to draw it, thinking left side of the brain, here's the plant. Okay, over to the left is my mortar and pestle, and then over to the right is the mug. I'm not paying attention to overlapping. I'm not paying attention to the negative spaces that are created, not just around one object, but between the two. And that's usually a good gauge of, okay, I drew this too big, I drew this too far over, I drew this too small. The negative space is important. It's just as important as the positive, right? So yeah, it's nice to know negative space so that you could create a negative space drawing. Maybe you look at a stool. Those are practice exercises as you're learning to draw. But now that we're getting into a more intermediate drawing approach, really think of how those negative spaces help. Like, why do we even learn about negative space? Why? So the reason is to help with proportion and to help with placement when you start to work with multiple objects. So I'm going to show you another spot. This is a really small little detail. So I have the negative space between the mug and the plant. Look at that tiny little spot. My mug is to the right, okay? And that's what I was supposed to do, but the mug is actually overlapping and creating a very minute little negative space. And I was like dramatic. Look at this big old space. But this is what I would get sometimes from students because they think left brain. Here's the plant, here's this, here's that. Don't let your left side of the brain give you directions. You're going to get lost and it's going to be a weird situation, right? So if I were to draw and continue to draw this still life, I would be looking at the still life and then paying attention to the negative spaces. Of course, I wouldn't be putting lines in, folks. This is so that you can see it. But I would be paying attention to the negative spaces around and between the objects, okay? Even, we know that the negative space in a mug, it's kind of like the same idea of a negative space when an arm is folded and the hand is on the hip. We pay attention to the subtle nuances of that space. The size of this space helps you determine the size of the handle. And if it's off, it's all off, okay? So negative space, just as important as the positive. You want to pay attention to size of it, the placement of it. And that's the trick to helping you make sure that your still life is how it looks, okay? We draw what we see, not what we know. So you could do the blocking in, and then you could work with the negative space. Start with constellations so that you don't have that problem where, oops, I'm chopping off this thing, or my favorite of, well, I'm going to end up stop drawing this object over here. So can I just like move it over here or not do it? That's not what we do. We draw what we see, not what we know. So that's it for this lesson about negative space, about constellations, proportion, placement, and drawing multiple objects together. Once you include another object, you have to consider them all. They're all together. It's a spatial relationship. All right, so remember, you don't have to do this. You get to do this. And the cool thing is every time you do it better than the time you did before. Have a great day.